Stanley Kubrick was born and raised in a Jewish family in the Bronx, a historic neighborhood of New York. As a child, he was shy and did not stand out much at school. His grades were quite low, and he preferred spending hours reading books, especially Greek myths and the stories of the Grimm brothers. His father, a respected doctor, recognized his son's talents and introduced him to two hobbies that would mark him for life. When Stanley was 12, his father taught him how to play chess, and when he was 13, he gave him his first camera. Stanley became fascinated with capturing images and developing them with the help of a neighbor who had a photographic laboratory at home. He then became the official photographer of his own school. He graduated in 1945 and wanted to go to university, but the number of war veterans entering higher education with government scholarships left him without a place. A little frustrated by that rejection, Kubrick adopted an autodidactic personality for the rest of his life, teaching himself everything he needed to move forward. Kubrick began his career selling photographs to Look, a leading magazine of the time, famous for its photographic reports. Before long, the magazine hired him as a staff photographer. Over the next 5 years, Kubrick built a reputation as a storyteller through images. He became known for capturing poses and compositions capable of transmitting emotions, symbols, and entire stories without needing words. At the same time, he supplemented his modest salary by playing chess for money in Washington Square Park and in clubs around Manhattan. At the beginning of the 1950s, Kubrick became obsessed with cinema. He became a regular at New York's movie theaters and at screenings held by the Museum of Modern Art. Soon, he found his masters. One was Max Ophuls, a German director known for his elegant camera movement. The other was Elia Kazan, a genius when it came to working with actors. But Kubrick also learned in another way, by visiting shops that rented cameras and film equipment, spending hours talking to the employees and absorbing everything he could. One day, while talking with his friend Alex Singer, who worked for a company that produced documentaries and news, Kubrick learned that making a documentary cost around $40,000 at the time. Kubrick thought he could make one for $1,500. That documentary would be called Day of the Fight. It ended up costing $3,900, but the lessons he learned while making it were invaluable. Soon after, he managed to sell it to RKO for $4,000, and he made 2 more short documentaries later on. Encouraged by the relative success of his first works, Kubrick quit Look and raised $10,000 to shoot his first feature film, a war drama called Fear and Desire. Critics liked the way it portrayed the beastly side of humanity during the war, but commercially it was a failure. It cost $53,000 and reached very few people. His next project was a noir crime film called Killer's Kiss. It performed slightly better with audiences and earned praise for his camera work, although the acting and story were heavily criticized. Around this time, Kubrick met James B. Harris during one of his chess games. They became friends and eventually founded their own production company, Harris Kubrick Pictures. Harris bought the rights to a novel that Kubrick would adapt for the screen under the title The Killing, his first truly professional Hollywood project. The two friends moved to Los Angeles and fought to get the film released in cinemas. After a lot of negotiation, they succeeded. Although The Killing was not especially popular with audiences at the time, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer became interested in the young director. The first was Paths of Glory, another war drama starring Kirk Douglas. The second was One-Eyed Jacks, a western with Marlon Brando, which Kubrick eventually abandoned due to problems with the studio. And then came Spartacus. For Kubrick, Spartacus was an incredibly difficult project. He had never made a film on that scale before. At one point, he worked with 10,000 extras in a single scene. A production of that size made the studio nervous, and they constantly interfered with his work. His relationship with Kirk Douglas was also complicated. Douglas would become offended when scenes were changed or his dialogue was rewritten, but the struggle was not in vain. Spartacus became a commercial success, established Kubrick's reputation as one of the most important filmmakers of the moment, and was even nominated for 6 Oscars, winning 4. After all those difficulties, Stanley became convinced that if he'd managed to finish a project of that magnitude successfully, then he could do anything. And with that attitude, Kubrick turned towards one of his most controversial projects. At the beginning of the 1960s, Kubrick decided to adapt Lolita, the novel by Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov wrote a 400-page screenplay that was impossible to film. The story followed Humbert Humbert, who marries Charlotte Hayes in order to get closer to her young daughter, Lolita. Kubrick, with the help of Harris, bought the rights and rewrote the screenplay extensively. During that time in the 60s, there was no modern age rating system, and the Hays Code was still in force, heavily restricting sexual or violent content on screen. Because of this, Kubrick had to use all his talent to make such a disturbing story pass through censorship, relying on visual metaphors, wordplay, suggestion, and several several other tricks. Kubrick's vision for Lolita was to look at the drama of the novel through the prism of black comedy. One of the first changes was the age of the protagonist. In the book, Lolita is 12, but in the film, her age is made more vague. Sue Leon, the actress who played Lolita, was 13 when she was cast, 14 during filming, and 15 by the time the production ended. The protagonist's disturbing sexual past was removed, and his most repulsive traits were softened. Even with these changes, though, it was difficult to convince actors to take part. Laurence Olivier and David Niven were both considered for the role of Humbert, but both withdrew out of fear of the repercussions. James Mason was eventually chosen to play the perverse literature professor. Shelley Winters played Charlotte, a role that reportedly led to frequent arguments with Kubrick on set. Some say the conflicts became so serious that she almost abandoned the production. Claire Quilty, Humbert's romantic rival, was brought to the screen by the legendary Peter Sellers, who fascinated Kubrick with his improvisational talent. Kubrick expanded his role compared with the novel. Although Lolita takes place in the United States, Kubrick decided to film it in the United Kingdom because of tax reductions offered there, and because he had grown tired of interference from major American studios. Over time, he would settle in the UK and end up filming the rest of his movies there. The shoot lasted 3 months between 1960 and 1961 at Associated British Elstree Studios. After several cuts and modifications to avoid censorship, the film was finally released in 1962. It made $3 million in its first few days, but it was not a huge commercial success either, especially considering that it had cost around $2 million. Beyond that, however, it would later be acclaimed by critics and become part of popular culture. And Kubrick enjoyed working with Peter Sellers so much, especially because of his gift for comedy, that he called him again for his next film, Dr. Strangelove. This film was a punchy comedy about the political tension between the United States and the Soviet Union in the early 1960s, filled with ironic humor about something as terrifying as nuclear holocaust. After this, Stanley Kubrick spent the rest of the 1960s preparing his next project, an ambitious and revolutionary idea that would bring together all the intuitions about cinema he had been developing for years. For Kubrick, cinema was a form of revelation. It was a way of making the viewer realize something about reality they could not see in any other way. But in order to see reality with new eyes, the spectator had to be taken out of the everyday. Kubrick also valued the visual nature of cinema above almost everything else. He wanted to explore how far one could tell a story using only images and sounds, with the least amount of dialogue possible. Moreover, Kubrick admired the depth and subtlety of great art. He loved how it allowed for multiple interpretations, how it could transmit ideas to the audience without making them obvious or direct. He loved the thrilling feeling of discovering meaning for yourself, and he wanted to create the same effect in the people who watched his films. All of these ideas would come together in what many consider his masterpiece, the one and only 2001, A Space Odyssey. This monumental project began to form in Kubrick's mind after he read Childhood's End, a novel by Arthur C. Clarke, in 1963. The premise of the novel, about an alien race supervising humanity's evolution, fascinated Kubrick and awakened his interest in the possibility of extraterrestrial life. And naturally, he began turning his attention towards science fiction films. He became a fan of a specific type of Japanese science fiction movies from the 1950s, but he wanted to go even further. As Kubrick usually liked to build his screenplays from existing literature, he contacted Clarke himself to discuss which of his books could be adapted. They met in New York, and Kubrick suggested beginning with The Sentinel, a 1948 short story describing the discovery of a monolith on the moon. Clarke did not think that story alone was enough, so they eventually agreed to use several different short stories as the basis for a novel, which would then become the foundation of the screenplay. The first draft was called Journey Beyond the Stars, then it became Universe, then Tunnel to the Stars, then Planetfall, before finally arriving at the definitive iconic title 2001, A Space Odyssey. Kubrick chose this title as a reference to Homer's Odyssey, the epic poem about Odysseus' journey across the Mediterranean on his way back to Ithaca. Stanley wanted to move audiences away from the idea that science fiction was just about monsters. He wanted to compare space to the feeling of infinity, danger, and mystery that the sea gave to the ancient Greeks. Kubrick spent years researching space exploration and imagining what it might look like in the future. He hired illustrators such as Chesley Bonestell, Roy Carnon, and Richard McKenna to help him design realistic and scientifically plausible environments. He also repeatedly watched documentaries of the time, such as Universe and To the Moon and Beyond, serving as inspiration. Filming began in December 1965 at Shepperton Studios, chosen because they were the only studios capable of housing the enormous set needed for the discovery of the monolith on the moon. Later, production moved to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios in Bournemouth, which were much smaller, for the scenes involving actors inside the spacecraft. The last scene to be filmed, and the only one to be shot outdoors, was the prehistoric prologue, filmed in Namibia in 1967. From that moment until the film's release in March 1968, Kubrick spent intense months working on editing and special effects. He instructed the technicians, helping him to recreate many of the effects in camera, because he wanted to avoid degrading the image quality, as often happened with green screens or matte paintings. This process significantly extended post-production. The film was finally released in April 1968, 16 months behind schedule and $6 million over the original budget. At first, critics were not very kind to it. Many did not understand its lack of dialogue, its slow rhythm, or its enigmatic story. But over time, both audiences and critics embraced it. By 1972, it had earned $31 million. It became a film that marked an entire generation. 2001: A Space Odyssey was the film that launched Stanley Kubrick into global fame. A shy, withdrawn boy from New York had become a cinematic legend. And from that point onward, Kubrick would continue to create unforgettable films such as A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, and Full Metal Jacket.